The blizzard screamed through the towering pines as Emily Carter stumbled into the clearing, her boots sinking into the snow with every desperate step. The biting wind clawed at her face, and her gloved hands gripped the leash tethered to Thor, her loyal canine partner. The German shepherd's body was rigid, his fur bristling as he let out a low, menacing growl. There, illuminated by the weak beam of Emily's flashlight, lay a wolf trapped in a snare, a crude, rusted device half buried in the snow. Its hind leg was caught in the jagged steel jaws, blood staining the pristine white around it. The wolf's chest heaved with ragged breaths, its amber eyes locked onto Thor with a mix of fear and feral defiance. Emily's pulse thundered in her ears as she inched closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Easy, easy now. I'm here to help." The wolf snarled weakly, but didn't move. It couldn't. The trap had done its cruel work, and then a sound shattered the fragile moment. A howl pierced the night, rising above the storm, sharp and ancient. It was answered almost immediately by a second, closer this time. Emily's stomach twisted into knots as she realized what it meant. Thor barked, a sharp defensive sound as his head whipped toward the tree line. Pairs of yellow eyes began to appear in the darkness, glowing like distant embers through the snowfall. One by one, wolves stepped out from the shadows, their bodies low, their movements deliberate, forming a loose circle around Emily and Thor. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The trapped wolf let out a weak, almost pleading whimper, and Emily felt something deep in her chest crack. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet stayed planted in the snow. She couldn't leave the wolf like this, not to die slowly in a trap, or worse, to be torn apart by its own pack. Thor's growl deepened, his body coiled like a spring, ready to fight. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't outpace a wolf pack. They were surrounded. No backup was coming. The storm had cut her off from radio contact hours ago. She was alone. Her breath caught as the alpha wolf emerged from the shadows. It was enormous, larger than any wolf Emily had ever seen. Its fur was a mottled mix of gray and white, its eyes sharp and intelligent, glowing with something ancient and unforgiving. The alpha padded forward slowly, its head low, lips pulled back just enough to reveal long, gleaming teeth. Its gaze flicked between Emily, Thor, and the injured wolf in the trap. Time seemed to freeze. Emily made her choice. Dropping to one knee, she fumbled with the trap's rusted mechanism, her gloved fingers trembling as she tried to pry it open. The wolves inched closer, their growls building in volume, reverberating in her chest like distant thunder. "Come on! Come on!" she hissed under her breath, her fingers slipping on the frozen metal. Thor stayed by her side, his body pressed close to hers, his growls sharp and unyielding. The alpha wolf stopped just feet away, its breath fogging in the icy air as it let out a single sharp bark. A command. The other wolves stopped advancing, their growls softening into a tense silence. Emily's hand slipped on the trap's spring one final time, and then it released. The wolf's leg sprang free, and it let out a sharp yelp of pain before collapsing onto the snow. For a moment, it didn't move, its sides heaving. Emily didn't dare breathe. The alpha stepped closer, its head lowering to sniff the injured wolf. The trapped animal let out a weak, submissive whimper, and the alpha responded with a low, rumbling growl, almost gentle. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the wolves began to disperse. One by one, they melted back into the forest, shadows swallowed by the storm. Only the alpha remained, its piercing eyes lingering on Emily for one long, unbearable moment before it too turned and disappeared into the night. Emily collapsed backward into the snow, her breath ragged as her pulse thundered in her ears. Thor pressed his nose against her cheek, letting out a low whine. "It's okay, boy. We're okay," she whispered, her voice cracking. But as she looked down at the injured wolf, still motionless in the snow, she knew their night wasn't over. The blizzard still raged around them, and somewhere out there, something or someone was still watching. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown more ferocious, whipping snowflakes sideways and reducing visibility to near zero. Emily huddled next to the injured wolf, her flashlight casting a narrow beam over its shivering form. Thor sat close by, his amber eyes scanning the darkness, ears flicking at every distant sound. His body was tense, his fur bristling, as if he could still sense the wolves just beyond their limited field of vision. Emily's breath fogged in front of her face as she studied the injured wolf. The animal was young, probably not even 2 years old, but its body was wiry and strong beneath the matted fur. Blood still seeped slowly from the wound on its hind leg, staining the snow a dark crimson. Every shallow breath it took was a battle. "We can't stay out here," Emily muttered to herself. "You're not going to make it in this cold." Her radio crackled softly, a burst of static that quickly died out. The storm had swallowed their connection entirely. No one was coming for them. Not yet. Thor let out a low whine and nudged Emily's arm with his cold nose. She reached down, rubbing behind his ears with numb fingers. "We need shelter, buddy. Now." Emily's eyes darted around, searching for anything. A cabin, a rocky outcrop, a dense cluster of trees that could offer even a shred of protection from the relentless wind and snow. Then, through the swirling frost, she spotted something. A faint shadow, angular and unnatural, just beyond the next rise. Her heart jumped. "Come on, Thor. Stay close." She knelt beside the injured wolf, wrapping her gloved hands gently around its trembling torso. "I know this hurts, but I need you to trust me, okay?" The wolf let out a faint whimper as Emily lifted it into her arms. It was lighter than she expected, its body limp and fragile against her chest. Thor pressed close to her side as she began trudging through the snow, one step at a time, her boots sinking deep with every movement. The wind roared louder, and every gust felt like knives slicing across her exposed skin. Her arms ached from carrying the wolf, but she didn't dare stop. Not now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but finally, Emily reached the shadow she had seen earlier. It was a small hunting cabin, half buried in snowdrifts, its wooden walls warped and weathered by years of brutal winters. The single window was cracked, and the front door hung slightly askew on rusted hinges. Emily didn't care. It was shelter. She kicked snow away from the door and pushed it open with her shoulder. It creaked in protest, and stale, cold air greeted her as she stepped inside. The cabin was little more than a single room with an ancient wood stove in the corner, a rickety table, and a dusty cot pushed against the far wall. It smelled of mildew and old wood, but it was dry, and that was enough. Thor, inside, now. Thor trotted in and immediately began sniffing every corner of the room, his tail stiff as he checked for any unseen threats. Emily laid the wolf down carefully on the cot, pulling a thermal blanket from her pack and wrapping it snugly around its fragile frame. She knelt beside it, her forehead nearly touching the wolf's as she whispered, "You're safe now. We're safe." Thor circled once before lying down near the cot, his eyes fixed on the door. Emily turned her attention to the wood stove. A small pile of firewood sat next to it, along with a box of matches so old the cardboard crumbled in her hands. After several tries, she managed to coax a small flame to life. The fire crackled weakly at first, then grew stronger, spreading warmth through the frigid air. Emily collapsed next to Thor, her head resting against the stove's side as her body began to thaw. Silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the wolf's slow, shallow breaths. For a while, Emily allowed herself to believe they were safe, but the tension in Thor's body told her otherwise. His head snapped up every few minutes, ears twitching toward faint sounds beyond the cabin walls, shifts in the wind, branches snapping in the distance. Emily felt it too. They weren't alone. She glanced toward the window. The swirling snow made it impossible to see anything outside, but she felt it in her bones. Something was watching. Time passed slowly. The fire in the stove dimmed slightly, but its warmth still filled the tiny space. Emily unwrapped her scarf and unzipped her jacket, letting herself breathe easier for the first time in hours. Thor, however, hadn't relaxed. He was still curled up near the cot, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never closing. Emily looked at the injured wolf, whose chest still rose and fell, albeit faintly. She reached out and ran a hand lightly over its side, feeling the fragile rhythm of life beneath her fingertips. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" she said softly. But just as the tension in her shoulders began to ease, a sound cut through the silence. It was faint at first. A creak, a subtle crunch of snow just outside the cabin door. Emily's head snapped up, and Thor's ears shot forward. The sound came again, closer this time. Emily's hand reached instinctively for the flare gun strapped to her vest. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she slowly stood, her boots silent against the wooden floor. Thor let out a low, menacing growl, his body tense and ready. The sound stopped. For several long moments there was only silence, the kind that feels alive, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to break it. Then a sharp knock echoed through the cabin door. 3 deliberate, heavy knocks. Emily froze. No one knocks in a storm like this, no one. "Who's there?" she called, her voice firm despite the ice crawling up her spine. No response. The fire crackled softly behind her, and the injured wolf let out a weak whimper as if it could feel the shift in the air. Thor growled again, low and guttural, his hackles rising. Emily's finger hovered over the trigger of the flare gun, her knuckles white as she aimed it at the door. Outside, the wind howled. Snow battered the walls, but beyond that, silence. Another knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps. Emily swallowed hard, her breath shallow as the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. They weren't alone anymore, and whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't going away. The silence after the knock felt suffocating, pressing against Emily's ears as if the storm itself had paused to listen. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts, misting in the cold air. The faint crackle of the dying fire was the only sound inside the cabin. Thor stood at the door, his body coiled tight, ears pinned forward, teeth bared in a low, vibrating growl that she could feel in her chest. The injured wolf let out a faint whimper from the cot, shifting slightly beneath the thermal blanket. Emily's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the flare gun, the weight of it suddenly feeling insignificant against whatever was on the other side of that door. Another knock, 3 sharp, deliberate raps, each one cutting through the air like a blade. No one knocks in a storm like this, no one. "Who's there?" Emily's voice cracked slightly, but it was firm enough to carry across the small space. For a long moment there was nothing, only the wind howling outside and the faint groan of tree branches bending under the weight of ice. Then came the voice. "Open the door." It was male, deep, and disturbingly calm, calmer than anyone should be in the middle of a whiteout. Emily's stomach clenched and her finger hovered over the trigger of the flare gun. "I said, who are you?" she barked, her voice sharper now. The man on the other side chuckled softly. It wasn't friendly, it wasn't warm. "Just someone looking for shelter. Looks like you've got a warm fire in there. Plenty of room for one more." Thor's growl grew louder, his teeth flashing as he stepped closer to the door. "Back away," Emily said. "You're not coming in here." The voice lost its softness, replaced with a low, cutting edge. "You don't want to make this difficult, Ranger." Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. "He knows I'm a ranger." She didn't answer. Instead, she slowly backed away from the door, keeping her eyes locked on the shadow slipping under the crack at the base of the wood. The faint shuffle of boots in the snow told her he wasn't leaving. He was circling. Thor turned, following the movement with his head, his growl rumbling like distant thunder. Then came the sound, a faint scraping noise near the window. Emily spun just in time to see the shadow of a gloved hand press against the frost-covered glass. The man was trying to see inside. Emily moved quickly, snatching a chair and shoving it beneath the doorknob. It wasn't much, but it was something. She grabbed a metal poker from beside the wood stove and stood near the wolf, her eyes darting between the door and the window. "Thor, stay close," she whispered. The injured wolf let out another weak whimper, its pale blue eyes opening slightly as if it could sense the danger in the air. The man's voice came again, this time from somewhere near the window. "You think you can just keep me out, Ranger? You think you can hide in there forever?" Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. He was toying with her, like a predator circling prey. The storm had isolated them completely. No backup, no radio contact, and no one to hear them scream. She had to make a choice. Time crawled forward in slow, aching moments. Emily stayed crouched near the cot, her knees trembling as she clutched the flare gun and the fire poker in white-knuckled fists. Thor hadn't moved from his spot, his eyes flicking between the door and the window, every muscle in his body taut and ready. Then the sound shifted. It wasn't a voice this time, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over snow, moving away from the cabin. Emily's brow furrowed. Is he leaving? But something in her gut told her no. Predators don't abandon prey, not when they've come this far. Thor let out one sharp bark, his head snapping toward the window again. Emily followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. The man wasn't gone. He was watching from the tree line. Just far enough back to be little more than a shadowy silhouette, but close enough that she could feel the weight of his stare. Emily's fingers dug into the flare gun grip, her breath coming in quick, sharp bursts. Think, Emily, think. The minutes passed, like hours. The storm howled and spat against the thin wooden walls, but inside the cabin, the silence was suffocating. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering shadows across the floor. Emily knew she couldn't stay here indefinitely. The wolf needed medical attention, and eventually that man would make his move, whether it was now or when exhaustion finally stole her edge. Thor let out a faint whine, his tail flicking nervously. Emily knelt beside him, pressing her forehead against his. "You're a good boy, Thor. The best boy," she whispered. She made up her mind. They couldn't wait for him to come to them. They had to move. Emily grabbed her pack, stuffing the last of the thermal blankets inside. She wrapped the injured wolf carefully, securing it as tightly as she could to her chest with the blanket and her coat. The wolf whimpered faintly, but didn't resist. Thor stayed close, his nose pressed to Emily's leg. She glanced at the door one last time, and then she moved. Emily shoved the door open and stepped out into the storm, the icy wind hitting her like a slap to the face. Thor bounded ahead, his nose low, ears pinned back as he led the way. Emily followed, clutching the wolf against her chest as her boots crunched over the snow. Behind them, somewhere in the dark, a rifle cracked. The sound split the night like lightning, and Emily ducked instinctively, her body curling protectively over the wolf. Thor barked furiously, spinning in place to face the source of the sound. Emily forced herself upright, her eyes scanning the tree line. There, a faint orange glow. A lantern, moving closer. The man was still hunting them. Emily's breath came in gasps as she pushed forward, following Thor as he wove through the snow-laden underbrush. They couldn't stop, not now. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the storm. Emily's chest heaved with exertion, her feet numb from the cold, but she kept moving. The storm swallowed them whole, and the glow of the lantern faded into the night. The snowstorm had swallowed the world in white, turning the forest into an endless maze of shadow and frost. Emily stumbled forward, clutching the injured wolf tightly against her chest. Each step felt heavier, the snow clawing at her boots and pulling her down. Her breath came in ragged gasps, misting in the frigid air as Thor bounded ahead, his nose low, ears flicking with every distant sound. The rifle shot still echoed in her mind, sharp and final. Somewhere behind them, in the dark and swirling snow, the man was still out there, tracking them, hunting them. Emily glanced over her shoulder, but the storm had erased everything behind her, leaving only a blank canvas of white. "Thor!" she shouted over the wind, her voice barely carrying. "Find us shelter, boy. We need somewhere safe." Thor turned his head slightly, his amber eyes locking with hers for just a moment before he pressed on, leading her through the storm. His movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if he could smell something, a trace, a scent, a memory etched into the snow. Emily's arms ached from carrying the wolf, its fragile body trembling weakly beneath the blanket. Every now and then, she'd feel the faint rise and fall of its chest against her, and it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. It was still alive. They all were. But for how much longer? They reached a cluster of large boulders, their jagged edges forming a rough overhang against the relentless wind. It wasn't much, but it was something, a pocket of stillness carved into the chaos. Thor squeezed into the narrow space first, turning back to bark softly as if urging Emily forward. She fell to her knees as she reached the shelter, lowering the wolf gently onto the packed snow beneath the overhang. Her gloved fingers fumbled as she adjusted the blanket, tucking it tighter around the wolf's shivering body. Thor curled up close beside it, his fur bristling against the cold. Emily collapsed against one of the rocks, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her head rested back as she closed her eyes, just for a moment, trying to block out the wind, the snow, and the gnawing fear that sat heavy in her chest. But rest wouldn't come. Thor let out a sharp bark, and Emily's eyes snapped open. His ears were pricked forward, his body low, and his amber eyes locked on something in the distance beyond their meager shelter. Emily followed his gaze, her pulse quickening. There, barely visible through the swirling snow, was a faint orange glow, the flicker of a lantern moving between the trees. He's still following us. The realization settled like a stone in her stomach. The poacher wasn't giving up. He was relentless, methodical, and armed. Emily's mind raced with possibilities, each one grimmer than the last. She couldn't stay here. The glow was getting closer. Her fingers brushed against the flare gun strapped to her vest. It was all she had left. A single shot, a brief flash of fire and light. It wouldn't stop a determined man, but maybe it could buy them enough time to escape. "Thor," Emily whispered, leaning close to the German shepherd. His ears twitched and his eyes met hers. "You need to guide us again, buddy. We can't stay here." The wolf let out a faint whimper from beneath the blanket, and Emily's chest tightened. They couldn't move far, not with the wolf in this condition. Every step was another gamble, another chance for the poacher to find them. But staying meant certain death. Emily hoisted the wolf back into her arms, biting back a groan as her exhausted muscles protested. Thor slipped out from beneath the overhang, his paws barely making a sound in the snow. They began moving again. Every step felt like an eternity, every gust of wind slicing against Emily's exposed face. Thor led them through narrow trails, weaving between snow-laden pines and ducking under low-hanging branches. Emily could feel her energy draining with every step, her body screaming for rest. But then, something changed. The trees began to thin, and Emily spotted something through the haze of snow. A small ravine, its walls jagged and steep, but with a frozen river cutting through its center. Thor stopped at the edge, turning back to Emily with expectant eyes. She hesitated. The descent was steep, the path treacherous. One misstep could send her tumbling, and with the wolf in her arms, she couldn't risk a fall. But behind her, the faint glow of the lantern flickered again. Closer now, she had no choice. "Easy, Thor. Go slow," Emily said softly. Thor began his descent first, his body low, paws finding purchase on the icy rocks. Emily followed, her boots sliding with every step as she carefully picked her way downward. She clutched the wolf tighter, her breath coming in sharp gasps as her foot slipped, just once, and she barely caught herself against a rock. When they finally reached the bottom, the air felt still, quieter somehow. The frozen river stretched out in both directions, its surface cracked and uneven. Emily collapsed onto her knees, clutching the wolf tightly to her chest. Thor let out a sharp bark, his head snapping upward toward the ridge they had just descended. Emily followed his gaze. The lantern glow was there, perched at the edge of the ravine like an omen. The man had followed them down, and now he was staring into the darkness below. Emily's heart pounded as she realized how exposed they were. The river was a flat, open expanse, a killing floor. There was no cover, no place to hide. And then he started descending. The glow bobbed with every step he took, slow and deliberate, the faint silhouette of a rifle slung across his chest growing clearer with every moment. Emily's hand went to the flare gun at her chest. She had one shot, one chance. But before she could act, a sound echoed through the ravine. It started faintly, a low, resonant howl that carried through the frozen air like an ancient warning. Thor's ears shot up, and even the injured wolf stirred beneath the blanket. The howl was joined by another, and another. From the ridge above, shadows began to move. Wolves. The pack was here. Emily's breath hitched as she realized what was happening. The wolves had followed them, not to hunt, not to stalk, but because of the injured wolf in her arms. This wasn't just survival instinct, it was something deeper. The man on the ridge paused. His lantern swung slightly as if he had realized his mistake. Emily met Thor's eyes. There was no more time to run. Whatever happened next, they had to face it here. The wolves howled again, their silhouettes blending into the storm, their yellow eyes glowing faintly like lanterns of their own. The man on the ridge hesitated, his shadow frozen against the snow, and then, slowly, he began to raise his rifle. Emily's knuckles turned white around the flare gun. The storm raged, the howls grew louder, and in that frozen hollow of ice and shadow, predator and prey collided in a moment that hung in fragile stillness, like the eye of a hurricane. The frozen world held its breath. The hunter stood at the edge of the ravine, his silhouette backlit by the pale flicker of his lantern. His rifle was raised, the barrel gleaming faintly under the weight of the storm's distant light. Below, Emily knelt on the cracked ice of the frozen river, clutching the injured wolf tightly against her chest. Thor stood in front of her, his body tense, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Above them, the wolves appeared, shadows against the snow-filled sky, their yellow eyes glowing like distant stars. The alpha stepped forward, its massive form framed against the storm. It let out a single resonant growl that seemed to roll across the frozen expanse and settle deep in Emily's chest. The poacher hesitated. For a moment his lantern wavered, and Emily could see his face, a mix of arrogance and fear etched into weathered skin. His knuckles tightened around the rifle's grip as he barked into the night, his voice sharp and edged with false bravado. "You think they'll protect you, Ranger? Wolves don't care about humans. They'll tear you apart just the same." Emily didn't answer. Her eyes stayed locked on him, her gloved hand trembling slightly as it gripped the flare gun. She only had one shot, and the distance between them felt impossibly far. The poacher's finger twitched near the trigger of his rifle. Thor let out a sharp bark, his body shifting slightly as if preparing to lunge. Time slowed. The wind roared through the ravine, carrying the scent of blood and sweat. The wolves above shifted restlessly, their eyes flickering between the poacher and Emily. The injured wolf in her arms let out a faint, pitiful whimper, its fragile body trembling against her. The poacher made his decision. He fired. The crack of the rifle shot split the night, echoing like thunder through the walls of the ravine. Emily flinched, her body instinctively curling around the wolf as the sound reverberated in her bones. But the shot went wide. Thor had lunged at the exact moment the poacher pulled the trigger. His bark, sharp and furious, had startled the man just enough to throw off his aim. The bullet ricocheted off an icy outcrop, sending shards of ice scattering into the air. The pack erupted into motion. Wolves surged down the ridge, their howls turning into snarls as they descended like shadows with teeth and claws. The poacher let out a guttural shout, dropping the lantern as he fumbled to reload his rifle. The light crashed against the ice, shattering and sputtering out, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight to illuminate the chaos. Emily moved. "Go, Thor!" she shouted as she scrambled to her feet, clutching the injured wolf against her chest. Thor turned and bolted alongside her, his body low as he guided her across the uneven ice. Behind them, the poacher's shouts were drowned out by the snarls and howls of the wolf pack. Emily didn't look back. She couldn't. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her vision narrowing to the path ahead. The ice beneath her boots cracked and groaned with every step. The frozen river was unstable, and one wrong move could send them plunging into the freezing water below. "Almost there," she gasped, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself, Thor, or the fragile wolf in her arms. A sharp scream cut through the storm, a sound that didn't belong to any animal. Emily glanced back over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of the poacher disappearing beneath a tangle of snarling fur and flashing teeth. The wolves had reached him. Her stomach twisted. She didn't stop running. They reached the far side of the ravine, where the ice gave way to snow-covered earth and tangled roots. Emily stumbled, her knees hitting the snow as she collapsed against a frozen tree trunk. Thor circled back to her, panting heavily, his breath misting in the cold air. The injured wolf let out a faint sound, a mixture of pain and exhaustion. Emily pressed a hand to its side, feeling the faint rise and fall of its chest. They had made it. Thor let out a low whine and nudged Emily's shoulder with his nose, as if urging her to keep moving. But Emily couldn't, not yet. Her lungs burned, her arms ached, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. The wolves on the far side of the ravine had stopped their pursuit. They lingered on the ridge, their glowing eyes fixed on Emily and Thor. The alpha wolf stood at the front, its broad chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, its gaze steady and ancient. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the storm, its pack following in silent procession. The world fell quiet again, save for the whisper of the wind through the trees. Emily's head fell back against the tree as she closed her eyes. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, her mind racing to process everything that had just happened. Thor lay down beside her, his body pressed against her side, his warmth seeping through the layers of her clothes. The injured wolf stirred faintly in her arms, its pale blue eyes flickering open to meet hers. It was still alive, still fighting. Emily let out a weak, broken laugh as tears froze against her lashes. "We did it, Thor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We made it." But they weren't out of danger yet. The wolf needed real medical attention, and Emily knew they were still far from the ranger station, still deep in the wilderness with the storm closing in. She couldn't stop now. Pushing herself upright, Emily adjusted the wolf in her arms and turned to Thor. "All right, boy, let's get him home." Thor barked softly, his tail wagging faintly as he fell into step beside her. They walked slowly into the frozen dawn, the sky painted with faint streaks of pink and gold as the storm finally began to break. Above them, the faint howl of a wolf echoed one last time, a haunting, beautiful sound that carried through the crisp morning air. The pack was gone, the poacher silenced, and somewhere ahead, safety awaited. But the wilderness wasn't finished with them yet. The sky blushed with the first light of dawn as Emily trudged through the thinning snowdrifts, clutching the injured wolf tightly against her chest. Her legs felt like stone pillars, her breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged in the icy air. Beside her, Thor walked silently, his paws pressing soft prints into the fresh snow. His head stayed low, his ears twitching at every distant sound, but his amber eyes never left Emily. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but Emily could see it now, a thin plume of smoke rising faintly over the treetops in the distance. The ranger station, safety, civilization, the finish line. "We're almost there, Thor," Emily whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse. "Almost home." The injured wolf stirred slightly in her arms, letting out a faint whimper. Its pale blue eyes blinked open, glancing up at her with something that felt like trust, like it knew she wasn't going to let it down. Emily's chest tightened. "You hang in there, okay? We're not giving up now." They reached the tree line an hour later. The forest gave way to a clearing, and there, tucked against a hill, stood the ranger station, a sturdy wooden structure with smoke curling lazily from its chimney. Emily's knees nearly buckled at the sight. It felt impossible that they had made it, that the nightmare of the night before was behind them. Thor let out a bark, sharp, triumphant, and loud enough to carry across the clearing. Almost immediately, the front door of the station flew open, and Ranger Lucas Hayes, Emily's colleague and friend, appeared in the doorway. His face was etched with worry, his beard flecked with frost as he stepped into the snow. "Emily!" he shouted, disbelief in his voice. "Is that you?" Emily stumbled forward, her boots crunching over the frozen ground. "Lucas, But she didn't get to finish. Lucas was already running toward her, arms outstretched. "Jesus, Emily!" Lucas grabbed her by the shoulders, his eyes scanning her face, her frostbitten cheeks, and then landing on the injured wolf in her arms. His brow furrowed. "What happened out there?" Emily's voice wavered. "It's a long story, Lucas, but we need to save him. He's hurt. Bad." Lucas nodded, his face set with determination. "Get inside, now." The warmth inside the ranger station was almost painful at first. Emily's frozen face stung as she stepped inside, the sudden rush of heat bringing blood back to her extremities. Thor padded in beside her, shaking off a layer of snow and immediately lying down near the wood stove. Lucas moved with swift efficiency, clearing the station's small first aid corner and spreading out clean blankets on the floor. Emily laid the wolf down gently, her arms aching as she unwrapped him from the thermal blanket. The young wolf was still breathing, but its breaths were shallow, its body trembling from exhaustion and shock. Lucas knelt beside Emily, his hands steady as he inspected the wound. "It's not as bad as it looks, but infection is our biggest enemy now. We'll need to clean this, dress it, and keep him warm." Emily nodded, her chest tight with relief. The injured wolf's survival felt within reach for the first time since she had found it in that cruel snare. As Lucas began his work, Emily leaned against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. Thor padded over and rested his head in her lap, letting out a heavy sigh, as if he too had been carrying the weight of the entire world. "You did good, boy," Emily whispered, running her fingers through his fur. "Better than good." Lucas glanced up briefly, his brow furrowed. "Emily, are you okay? You're frostbitten, exhausted. When was the last time you ate something?" She managed a weak smile. "I'm fine. I'll rest once I know he's okay." Lucas didn't argue. Instead, he nodded and turned his attention back to the wolf, carefully cleaning the wound and murmuring reassurances as if the animal could understand him. Hours passed in a blur. The wolf was cleaned, the wound bandaged, and its body nestled into a cocoon of warm blankets near the stove. Emily sat nearby, sipping hot coffee from a battered tin mug, Thor curled up at her feet. Lucas lowered himself into the chair across from her, his face etched with exhaustion and quiet respect. "You're lucky to be alive, Emily," he said softly. "Both of you." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the injured wolf. "It wasn't just luck, Lucas. Thor, the pack, they made this possible. Without them, we wouldn't have made it." Lucas followed her gaze and let out a low whistle. "Wolves don't usually let humans walk away from something like that. Whatever happened out there, it was special." Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes growing distant. "It was more than special, Lucas. It felt right, like we understood each other, just for a moment." The days passed slowly, but each one brought improvement. The wolf, now nicknamed Echo by Emily, began to recover. Its leg healed with care and time, and its sharp blue eyes began to lose their haze of exhaustion. Thor became its quiet guardian, often lying beside Echo as if keeping watch over a younger sibling. On the 5th day, Emily stood in the clearing behind the station, watching as Echo took its first tentative steps outside. The snow had stopped falling, and the air was crisp and clear. Thor walked alongside Echo, his tail wagging softly as the wolf sniffed the air, ears twitching at distant sounds from the forest. Emily knelt down, her voice soft. "It's time, isn't it?" Echo turned its head, those pale blue eyes locking with hers, and for one brief moment, Emily swore the wolf understood her. Then, with a final glance back, Echo disappeared into the trees, its lean body slipping effortlessly into the wild. Emily stayed kneeling in the snow, her breath catching in her throat. Thor sat beside her, his head resting against her shoulder. "He's where he belongs now, boy," Emily whispered. Above them, a faint howl carried through the still winter air, a sound so haunting and beautiful it felt like a farewell. Emily smiled softly as she rose to her feet. brushing snow from her knees. "Come on, Thor, let's go home." Thor barked once, sharp and clear, before bounding ahead, his tail wagging with each step. As Emily followed him back to the warmth of the ranger station, she felt something shift deep inside her, something old and wild and at peace. The wilderness had given her a gift: trust, survival, and a bond that crossed the fragile boundary between species. And in that fragile, perfect balance, Emily knew she had been changed forever.